The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Ashford Palace as Alexander Windsor straightened his navy blue uniform one final time. The golden buttons gleamed against the crisp fabric, each one polished to perfection by the palace staff who had served his family for generations. Today would be different from all the ceremonial occasions he had attended before. Today, he would say goodbye to the only life he had ever known. Charlotte stood at the tall window of their private chambers, her reflection ghost-like in the glass as she watched the gathering crowd below. Even from 3 stories up, she could see the sea of people stretching beyond the palace gates, their faces turned upward with a mixture of curiosity and concern. News had traveled quickly through the kingdom of Valdoria that their beloved Prince Alexander had made an unprecedented decision that would change everything. The decision had not come easily. For months, Alexander had wrestled with the weight of duty versus the call of his heart. Born into the royal family of Valdoria, a small but prosperous European nation nestled between Switzerland and Austria, he had been groomed since childhood to one day take the throne. His education had been carefully crafted, from languages and diplomacy to economics and military strategy. Every public appearance had been choreographed, every word measured for its impact on the kingdom's reputation. But 3 years ago, everything had changed when he met Charlotte Melbourne, a passionate environmental scientist who had been leading a research expedition in Valdoria's protected mountain regions. She had been documenting the effects of climate change on alpine ecosystems when their paths crossed during one of Alexander's visits to the conservation areas. Unlike the carefully arranged meetings with nobility and diplomats that filled his calendar, this encounter had been genuine, unscripted, and utterly transformative. Charlotte had not recognized him at first, seeing only a man in hiking gear who seemed genuinely interested in her work. They had spent hours discussing the delicate balance of mountain ecosystems, the migration patterns of endangered species, and the urgent need for environmental protection. It was only when his security detail appeared that she realized she had been speaking to the crown prince of Valdoria. Their courtship had been conducted largely in secret, away from the prying eyes of the media and the expectations of the royal court. Alexander would slip away from his official duties whenever possible to join Charlotte in her research, learning to appreciate the natural world through her passionate perspective. In the mountains and forests of Valdoria, he discovered a version of himself he had never known existed, one that was driven by genuine curiosity rather than duty, by love rather than obligation. When they married in a beautiful but modest ceremony 2 years ago, the people of Valdoria had embraced Charlotte with open arms. She brought a refreshing authenticity to the royal family, speaking candidly about environmental issues and connecting with citizens from all walks of life. Unlike previous royal consorts who had been chosen from other noble families, Charlotte's background as a scientist and activist represented something new and hopeful for the kingdom. But the happiness they found together had come at a cost that was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. The traditional expectations of royal life, the endless ceremonial functions, the careful political neutrality, the constant public scrutiny, felt increasingly incompatible with the work Charlotte was passionate about and the life they wanted to build together. The couple found themselves torn between their love for Valdoria and its people and their desire to make a meaningful impact on the global environmental crisis. The breaking point had come 6 months earlier during the International Climate Summit in Geneva. Charlotte had been invited to present her research on alpine ecosystem preservation, but protocol dictated that she could only attend as the prince's wife, not as a scientist in her own right. Watching her brilliant mind and passionate advocacy reduced to a ceremonial role had been more than Alexander could bear. That night, in their hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, they had made the decision that would reshape their lives forever. Alexander would renounce his claim to the throne, allowing his younger brother James to become heir apparent. They would leave Valdoria to establish an international environmental foundation, dedicating their lives to the climate work that had brought them together and that they both felt called to pursue. The announcement had sent shockwaves through Valdoria and beyond. Royal correspondents struggled to find precedent for such a decision in modern European history. Political analysts debated the implications for the kingdom's stability. But, perhaps most surprisingly, the reaction from the Valdorian people had been largely supportive. Online polls showed that nearly 70% of citizens respected Alexander's choice, with many expressing admiration for his willingness to follow his convictions even at great personal cost. Now, as the moment of their official departure approached, Alexander felt the weight of what they were leaving behind. Every stone in the palace walls held memories, childhood games of hide, and, seek in the vast corridors, state dinners where he had learned the art of diplomacy, quiet moments with his grandmother, the late Queen Isabella, who had taught him that true leadership came from love rather than power. Charlotte turned from the window as footsteps approached their door. A soft knock preceded the entrance of Margaret Thornfield, Alexander's longtime private secretary, whose composed demeanor had been a constant through years of royal protocols and procedures. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret began, then caught herself with a sad smile. "Alexander," she corrected, using his first name as he had requested now that formal titles would soon be meaningless. "The cars are ready, and the crowd has gathered in the courtyard as planned." Alexander nodded, reaching for Charlotte's hand. Her fingers were cold despite the warm morning, and he could feel the slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness. They had faced public appearances before, but never one quite like this. Never one where their words would mark the end of one chapter of their lives and the uncertain beginning of another. "Are you ready?" he asked her softly, his voice carrying all the love and uncertainty he felt. Charlotte squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his presence, as she had learned to do over their years together. "As ready as one can be to leave everything behind," she replied with a gentle smile that didn't quite hide the emotion in her eyes. They made their way through the familiar halls of the palace, their footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet that had settled over the usually bustling residence. Staff members they passed offered respectful nods and warm smiles, many struggling to maintain their professional composure in the face of this unprecedented farewell. Alexander had insisted on saying goodbye personally to each of them over the past week, thanking them for their years of dedicated service and assuring them that their positions would be secure under Prince James's eventual leadership. The grand staircase that led to the main entrance had never seemed so long. Each step downward felt like a step away from the identity Alexander had carried his entire life. At the bottom, Prince James waited with their parents, King Edward and Queen Catherine. The family resemblance was strong between the brothers, but where Alexander carried himself with the careful reserve of a future monarch, James had always been more relaxed, more willing to show his emotions openly. "Brother," James said simply, stepping forward to embrace Alexander, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. And how terrified," he added with a nervous laugh that broke some of the tension. King Edward, a man who had spent 4 decades balancing personal desires with royal duty, looked older than his 65 years as he faced the reality of his eldest son's choice. "The throne has never been more important than your happiness, Alexander," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I would be lying if I said this isn't one of the most difficult moments of my reign." Queen Catherine stepped forward to embrace Charlotte, the daughter-in-law who had brought such joy and vitality to their family. "Promise me you'll take care of each other," she whispered, her composure finally cracking slightly, "and that you'll remember Valdoria will always be your home." The massive oak doors of the palace opened, and the sound of the gathered crowd rushed in like a wave. Hundreds of Valdorian citizens had gathered in the courtyard and beyond the gates, their faces reflecting the complex emotions surrounding this moment. There were tears and smiles, signs of support, and expressions of confusion. Camera crews from international news networks had set up positions to capture what many were calling the most significant royal departure in a generation. Alexander and Charlotte stepped together into the bright morning sunlight, their hands clasped tightly as they approached the podium that had been set up for their farewell address. The crowd gradually quieted as Alexander stepped forward to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard thanks to the sound system that had been carefully arranged. "My dear friends and fellow citizens of Valdoria," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "Charlotte and I stand before you today, not to say goodbye forever, but to express our gratitude for the love and support you have shown us, and to explain the choice we have made together." He paused, looking out over the faces of people who had known him since childhood, who had cheered at his university graduation, who had celebrated his wedding with genuine joy. 3 years ago, I met a remarkable woman who opened my eyes to the urgent challenges facing our planet. Through her, I discovered that sometimes the greatest service we can offer is not the one we were born to provide, but the one our hearts call us toward. Charlotte stepped slightly closer, her presence a source of strength as Alexander continued. "The decision to renounce my claim to the throne was not made lightly. It came after months of reflection, prayer, and consultation with those I trust most. But ultimately, Charlotte and I believe we can serve the greater good more effectively by dedicating our lives to environmental conservation and climate action on an international scale." The crowd listened in respectful silence, many wiping away tears as the gravity of the moment settled over them. This was not just a royal departure. It was a young couple choosing love and conviction over tradition and comfort, and the courage of their choice was not lost on those who witnessed it. "I want you to know," Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger, "that my love for Valdoria and its people will never diminish. The values you have taught me, compassion, service, and dedication to the common good, will guide everything Charlotte and I do in the years ahead. And I have complete confidence that my brother James will serve as your prince, and one day your king, with the same dedication our family has always brought to this role." As Alexander spoke, Charlotte found herself studying the faces in the crowd, memorizing this moment that would mark such a profound transition in their lives. She saw elderly couples holding hands, young families with children perched on shoulders for a better view, students with their phones held high to capture history in the making. Each face told a story of connection to the royal family and to the institution they were leaving behind. The weight of their decision had never felt more real than in this moment, surrounded by the tangible evidence of what they were giving up. The palace behind them represented not just personal history, but centuries of tradition and responsibility. The people before them represented not just subjects or citizens, but a community that had embraced them both with open hearts. Yet even as the magnitude of their choice settled around them like a heavy cloak, Charlotte felt a deep sense of rightness about the path they had chosen. The work that awaited them, establishing a foundation dedicated to environmental conservation, bringing together scientists and policymakers from around the world, fighting for the planet's future, felt like the natural expression of everything their love had taught them about service and sacrifice. Alexander concluded his remarks with a promise that their departure did not mean an end to their connection with Valdoria, but rather a new chapter in their service to the values the kingdom had instilled in them. As he stepped back from the podium, Charlotte moved forward to offer her own words to the people who had welcomed her so warmly into their community and their hearts. Charlotte stepped forward to the microphone, her heart racing as she faced the sea of faces that had become so dear to her over the past 3 years. Unlike Alexander, who had been trained from childhood for public speaking, she still felt the flutter of nerves that came with addressing large crowds. But these were not strangers. These were the people who had embraced her despite her unconventional background, who had supported her environmental initiatives, and who had shown her what it meant to belong to a community larger than herself. "Citizens of Valdoria," she began, her voice carrying a slight tremor that somehow made her words more powerful rather than less. "When I first came to your beautiful country as a researcher, I never imagined that I would fall in love not just with your prince, but with all of you, and with the values that make Valdoria so special." The crowd stirred gently, and Charlotte could see tears glistening on many faces. She had become beloved among the people for her authentic approach to royal duties, her willingness to roll up her sleeves, and work alongside volunteers on conservation projects, and her genuine interest in their lives and concerns. Alexander and I did not make this decision to leave because we love you any less, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. We made it because you taught us that true service sometimes requires sacrifice, and that love, whether for a person, a country, or our planet, sometimes calls us to step outside our comfort zones to fight for what matters most. Behind her, the royal family stood in a line, their formal composure barely containing the emotion of the moment. Queen Catherine dabbed discreetly at her eyes with a handkerchief, while King Edward maintained the stoic expression he had perfected over decades of public service, though those who knew him well could see the pain in his eyes. Prince James stood tall beside his parents, already beginning to embody the weight of responsibility that would soon be his to carry. Charlotte's words carried across the courtyard and beyond to the millions watching on television and streaming online around the world. Social media was already buzzing with reactions to the unprecedented farewell, with hashtags like hashtag Alexander and Charlotte and hashtag Love Over Duty trending globally. People from dozens of countries were sharing their own stories of difficult choices between tradition and personal conviction, inspired by the courage they were witnessing. The climate crisis cannot wait for convenient timing, Charlotte continued, her passion for her work evident in every word. Every day we delay action is another day closer to irreversible damage to the only planet we have. Alexander, and I believe that by dedicating our full attention to this fight, we can honor the values Valdoria has taught us about caring for others and protecting what we love. In the crowd, Maria Santos wiped tears from her cheeks as she held her 6-year-old daughter Sophia on her shoulders. Maria had been one of the volunteers on Charlotte's first major conservation project in Valdoria, helping to restore damaged hiking trails in the mountain regions. She had watched the princess work alongside them in mud-covered boots and practical clothes, never complaining about the physical labor or the simple accommodations in the mountain huts where they stayed during the project. "Mama, why is everyone crying?" Sophia whispered, her young voice cutting through the emotional weight of the moment with innocent curiosity. "Sometimes, sweetheart," Maria replied softly. "People cry when they're proud of someone for being brave. The prince and princess are being very brave today." Sophia nodded solemnly, her child's mind accepting this explanation as she continued to wave the small Valdorian flag she had been given. Around them, other families shared similar quiet conversations. Parents tried to explain to their children why this moment was so significant, why the fairy tale they had watched unfold was taking such an unexpected turn. Near the front of the crowd, Dr. Heinrich Kraus, the elderly director of the Valdorian Institute for Alpine Studies, stood with his colleague Dr. Elizabeth Reimer. They had been among the first to recognize Charlotte's exceptional scientific mind when she arrived in Valdoria, and they had watched with pride as she balanced her royal duties with continued contributions to environmental research. "She's right, you know," Dr. Kraus murmured to his colleague as Charlotte spoke about the urgency of climate action. "The papers she's published since joining the royal family have been groundbreaking. If anyone can bridge the gap between scientific research and policy implementation, it's her." Dr. Reimer nodded, though her expression remained sad. "I understand why they're leaving, but Valdoria will lose so much. She's inspired an entire generation of young people here to pursue environmental science. Applications to our programs have tripled since she became princess." Their conversation reflected a sentiment being echoed throughout the crowd and around the world. While many admired Alexander and Charlotte's conviction, there was also genuine grief at losing their presence and influence within the traditional structures of power and service that had shaped their public roles. As Charlotte concluded her remarks with a promise to continue working for Valdoria's environmental interests through their new foundation, Alexander returned to her side. Together, they began what they had planned as the most difficult part of their farewell, moving through the crowd to personally thank as many people as possible for their years of support. The security arrangements for this walkabout had been carefully planned, but Nothing could have prepared the couple for the emotional intensity of these final personal interactions. Alexander found himself embraced by elderly citizens who had served his grandfather, King George, during his reign. They pressed small gifts into his hands, handwritten letters, family photographs, simple trinkets that represented decades of loyalty to the royal family. Charlotte was surrounded by the children from the environmental youth groups she had helped establish throughout Valdoria. 12-year-old Thomas Weber, whose science fair project on renewable energy had won national recognition after Charlotte served as a judge, stepped forward with a poster signed by his entire class. "Princess Charlotte," he said formally, though his voice shook with emotion, "we made this to thank you for teaching us that we can make a difference, even when we're kids. We promise to keep working to protect our planet, just like you taught us." Charlotte knelt down to Thomas's eye level, accepting the poster with hands that trembled slightly. The artwork showed children from around the world holding hands around a green and blue earth with the words "Thank you for showing us how to care" written in a dozen different languages. "Thomas," she said softly, "you and your classmates are the reason Alexander and I have hope for the future. Promise me you'll never stop believing that your voices matter, that your actions can change the world." The interaction, captured by dozens of photographers and videographers, would become one of the defining images of the farewell. The sight of a princess kneeling in her elegant dress on the cobblestones to embrace a young environmental activist perfectly encapsulated the values that had driven their decision to leave traditional royal life behind. As they continued through the crowd, Alexander and Charlotte encountered representatives of nearly every organization and community they had worked with during their years of service. There were teachers from the schools where Charlotte had promoted environmental education, soldiers from Alexander's regiment who had served alongside him during his military training, and dozens of volunteers from various charitable initiatives they had supported together. Each interaction carried its own emotional weight, but perhaps none more so than their encounter with the Fitzgerald family. 2 years earlier, when 10-year-old Emma Fitzgerald had been diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia, Charlotte had quietly arranged for the family to receive the best possible medical care. During Emma's long treatment, both Alexander and Charlotte had visited regularly, not as part of any official duty, but simply because they had come to care deeply for the brave little girl and her worried parents. Now Emma stood before them in full remission, her hair grown back in soft curls, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from her family's garden that morning. Her parents, John and Sarah Fitzgerald, could barely contain their emotions as they approached. "Your Royal Highnesses," Sarah began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the moment. "Sarah, John," Charlotte said warmly, "how is our Emma doing?" Emma stepped forward with the confident smile that had charmed them during their hospital visits. "I'm all better now, Princess Charlotte, and I've been learning about trees and animals like you taught me. I want to be a scientist like you when I grow up." This simple declaration, delivered with a matter-of-fact conviction that only a child could possess, struck both Alexander and Charlotte with unexpected force. Here was tangible evidence of the impact they had made, not through grand gestures or official programs, but through genuine human connection and caring. Charlotte accepted the wildflowers with tears streaming down her cheeks, all pretense of royal composure abandoned in the face of such innocent love and gratitude. Alexander placed his hand on Emma's shoulder, his own eyes bright with emotion. "Emma," he said seriously, "I want you to know that people like you, brave, curious, determined people, are the reason we believe the future can be bright. Never stop asking questions. Never stop caring about the world around you." The Fitzgeralds were not the only family whose lives had been personally touched by Alexander and Charlotte's compassion. Throughout the crowd were people who had experienced their kindness during times of crisis, families who had lost homes to flooding and received not just official disaster relief, but personal visits and ongoing support, elderly citizens whose loneliness had been eased by unexpected royal attention to their needs, young people whose ambitions had been encouraged and supported through mentorship programs the couple had quietly established. As the walkabout continued, the planned schedule began to stretch longer and longer. Security personnel grew nervous about the extended exposure, but Alexander and Charlotte were reluctant to cut short these final moments with the people who had meant so much to them. Each conversation felt precious, each embrace a connection that would soon be broken by distance and changed circumstances. The international media coverage of the farewell was unlike anything seen in recent royal history. News anchors struggled to find adequate words to describe the genuine emotion on display, the authentic connections between the departing royals and their people. Royal experts debated the implications of such a public display of feeling, some arguing it was inappropriate for members of the royal family to show such emotion, others praising the honesty and humanity of the moment. On social media, the hashtag Royal Farewell was generating millions of posts as people around the world shared their own reactions to the unprecedented scene. Videos of Charlotte kneeling to embrace young Thomas, of Alexander receiving handmade gifts from elderly citizens, of the couple's obvious struggle to maintain composure while saying goodbye to Emma Fitzgerald, were being shared and reshared with comments of admiration, sadness, and inspiration. But perhaps the most powerful moment was yet to come. As Alexander and Charlotte neared the end of their planned route through the crowd, they encountered a group that made both of them stop in surprise and deep emotion. Standing together in matching green t-shirts were nearly 50 of the environmental volunteers who had worked with Charlotte on various conservation projects throughout her time as princess. The group had organized themselves without any official coordination, traveling from mountain villages and research stations across Valdoria to be present for this farewell. Their leader, Dr. Anna Bergman, who had served as Charlotte's research partner on several alpine ecosystem studies, stepped forward with a presentation that would become one of the most memorable moments of the entire day. Princess Charlotte, Prince Alexander, Dr. Bergman began, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet courtyard. We wanted you to know that your work here has already changed lives and will continue changing lives for generations to come. We have a gift for you, not just from us, but from the mountains and forests you have helped protect. She gestured to her colleagues, who produced a small sapling in a simple clay pot. This is a Swiss pine seedling, grown from seeds collected in the high alpine zones where your conservation work has been most impactful. We want you to take it with you as a reminder that the roots you've planted in Valdoria will continue to grow, no matter where your path leads you. The symbolism of the gift was not lost on anyone present. The Swiss pine, known for its resilience and longevity, could live for centuries in harsh mountain conditions. Like the impact Alexander and Charlotte had made on their country, it would endure long after they were gone, growing stronger with time and providing shelter and sustenance for future generations. Charlotte accepted the small pine sapling with trembling hands, cradling the clay pot against her chest as if it were something infinitely precious. The simple gift represented everything she was leaving behind and everything she hoped to carry forward. The connection to Valdoria's natural heritage, the community of dedicated conservationists who had become like family, and the promise that their work together would continue to bear fruit even across great distances. This means more to us than you could possibly know, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. We promise to plant it somewhere special, where it can remind us every day of the home we're leaving and the people we'll never stop loving. Alexander stood beside her, his own composure finally beginning to crack as the full reality of their departure settled over him. This was no longer an abstract decision made in private conversations and official meetings. This was the moment of actual separation from the life, the people, and the purpose that had defined his entire existence until now. Dr. Bergman wasn't finished with her presentation. We also want to share something else with you, she continued, pulling out a tablet device. Over the past month, we've been collecting video messages from conservationists, scientists, and environmental activists around the world who have heard about your decision and want to support your new mission. The tablet came to life with a compilation video that would later be shared millions of times across social media platforms. Scientists from the Arctic research stations spoke about the urgency of climate action. Activists from small island nations threatened by sea level rise shared their hopes for international cooperation. Children from schools in dozens of countries held up signs thanking Alexander and Charlotte for choosing to fight for their future. The final message in the compilation came from Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a legendary climate scientist who had spent 40 years documenting the effects of global warming. Her words carried special weight given her reputation and the respect she commanded in the international scientific community. Alexander and Charlotte, Dr. Hoffman said from her office, surrounded by decades of research, your decision to step away from traditional royal duties to focus on environmental work represents exactly the kind of bold leadership our planet needs. Climate change doesn't respect borders or titles. It requires people who are willing to prioritize the future of our planet over personal comfort or convention. We're honored to have you join this fight, and we promise to support your foundation's work in every way we can. As the video concluded, Alexander found himself looking out over the crowd with new eyes. These people had supported their decision, even knowing it meant losing their direct connection to the royal family. They had chosen to celebrate courage over tradition, conviction over convenience. The realization that their choice had inspired rather than disappointed their people brought a new dimension of emotion to an already overwhelming day. But the personal farewells were not yet complete. At the edge of the crowd, Alexander spotted a figure that made his heart clench with particular sadness. Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, his childhood nanny who had cared for him from infancy through his teenage years, stood quietly holding a small wrapped package. Despite being in her 70s now, she had insisted on being present for this farewell, even though the long-standing and emotional intensity of the day would be difficult for her. Alexander immediately broke away from the planned route and walked directly to her, ignoring protocol in favor of the personal connection that mattered far more in this moment. Mrs. Ashworth had been like a second mother to him, the one who had comforted him through childhood fears, celebrated his accomplishments, and provided the emotional stability that formal royal upbringing sometimes lacked. "Nanny," he said simply, using the childhood name that he hadn't spoken aloud in years. The formal distance of adulthood melted away as he embraced the woman who had shaped so much of who he had become. "My dear boy," Mrs. Ashworth replied, her voice steady despite her tears. "I'm so proud of the man you've become, and so proud of the choice you're making. Your grandmother, Queen Isabella, would have understood completely. She always said that true nobility comes from following your conscience, not your birthright." She pressed the small package into his hands, and Alexander could feel immediately that it contained something with significant weight, both physical and emotional. "This is something I've been saving for the right moment," she explained. "It belonged to your grandmother, and she made me promise to give it to you when you needed reminding of who you really are, not just who you were born to be." Alexander unwrapped the package with careful reverence, revealing a simple leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth by years of handling, and when he opened it, he discovered pages filled with Queen Isabella's distinctive handwriting. These were her personal reflections on the challenges of royal life, her struggles with balancing duty and personal conviction, and her deepest thoughts about what it meant to serve others with integrity. One passage, marked with a ribbon bookmark, immediately caught his attention. "There will come a day when my grandson must choose between the crown he was born to wear and the life he was born to live. I pray he will have the courage to choose wisely, knowing that true kingship lies not in ruling over others, but in serving the highest good, whatever form that service might take." The prophetic words, written decades earlier, struck Alexander with their uncanny relevance to his current situation. His grandmother had somehow understood that this moment might come, and had prepared this final gift to support him when the time arrived. The discovery that Queen Isabella had anticipated and approved of his choice provided a comfort he hadn't known he needed. Charlotte had been watching the interaction from a few steps away, giving Alexander space for this private moment with someone who had been so important to his childhood. But Mrs. Ashworth gestured for her to come closer, reaching out to embrace the woman who had brought such joy to the grandson she had helped raise. "Charlotte, my dear," she said warmly, "you've given Alexander something I could never provide, a purpose that comes from his heart rather than his inheritance. That's the greatest gift you could have offered him, and I thank you for it." The exchange between these two women from such different worlds, one representing the traditional structures of royal service, the other embodying the new possibilities for meaningful impact, seemed to symbolize the bridge Alexander and Charlotte were building between their royal past and their environmental future. As the formal farewell ceremony drew toward its conclusion, Alexander and Charlotte made their way back toward the palace steps where their car waited to take them to the airport. Their luggage had been loaded earlier, along with the small pine sapling that would make the journey with them to whatever country would host their new foundation headquarters. The timing of their departure had been carefully planned to coincide with the golden hour before sunset, creating a cinematic backdrop for their final moments in Valdoria. The warm light cast everything in soft, nostalgic tones that would make the photographs and video footage of this day particularly memorable for years to come. Prince James stepped forward one final time to embrace his brother, their conversation too quiet for the crowd or media to overhear. But those close enough could see the mixture of pride, sadness, and determination on both their faces as they prepared for the transition of responsibility that would change both their lives forever. "The crown will be safe with you," Alexander said quietly, gripping his brother's shoulder. "You've always been the better listener, the one who sees what people need rather than what they expect. Valdoria is fortunate to have you." James nodded, his throat too tight for extensive conversation. "Just promise me you'll be happy," he managed. "Promise me this isn't a sacrifice you'll regret." "Look at her," Alexander replied, glancing toward Charlotte, who was saying her own goodbyes to Queen Catherine. "Look at the work we're going to do together. This isn't a sacrifice. It's the beginning of a life we were always meant to live." King Edward and Queen Catherine had remained composed throughout most of the ceremony, their years of public service having taught them to maintain dignity even in the most emotional circumstances. But as the moment of actual departure arrived, even their carefully controlled emotions began to show through. Queen Catherine's farewell to Charlotte was particularly poignant. The two women had developed a genuine friendship over the past 3 years, bonding over their shared commitment to charitable work and their love for Alexander. Catherine had seen how Charlotte's presence had brought out the best in her son, had watched him become more confident, more purposeful, more himself than he had ever been during his traditional royal duties. "You've been the daughter I never had," Catherine whispered as she embraced Charlotte. "Distance can never change that. Promise me you'll stay in touch, that you won't let the work consume you so completely that you forget to enjoy the life you're building together." The goodbye between Alexander and his parents carried the weight of 32 years of relationship, of pride and expectations, disappointments, and achievements. King Edward, who had devoted his entire adult life to the crown that Alexander was now rejecting, struggled with complex emotions about his son's choice. "I may not fully understand your decision," he said quietly, "but I respect your right to make it. And I'm proud that I raised a son with enough integrity to follow his convictions, even when they lead him away from everything we planned for him." The words carried deep meaning for both men. King Edward was essentially acknowledging that successful parenting sometimes meant raising children who were strong enough to reject their parents' plans in favor of their own authentic paths. For Alexander, hearing his father's respect and approval removed the last shadow of doubt about their choice. As they walked toward the waiting car, Charlotte felt the weight of the small pine sapling in her arms and the even greater weight of all the hopes and expectations that were traveling with them. The environmental foundation they planned to establish would be scrutinized not just for its scientific work, but as the justification for their unprecedented departure from royal life. Every project they undertook, every success or failure, would be measured against the sacrifice they had made to pursue this path. But alongside the pressure, she felt an extraordinary sense of freedom and possibility. For the first time in 3 years, she would be able to speak her mind completely on environmental issues without worrying about political implications for the royal family. She could pursue research collaborations, attend scientific conferences, and advocate for policy changes without the constraints of royal neutrality. The work that had always been her passion would now become their full-time mission. The crowd had been gradually growing throughout the afternoon as word of the farewell ceremony spread. By the time Alexander and Charlotte reached their car, nearly 1,000 people had gathered in the palace courtyard and surrounding areas. The atmosphere was unlike anything the security personnel had ever managed, emotionally charged but completely peaceful, sad but also hopeful. As they paused at the car door for their final wave goodbye, something spontaneous and beautiful happened. Someone in the crowd began singing the Valdorian national anthem, and within moments hundreds of voices had joined in. The familiar melody rose across the courtyard, carried by people of all ages who wanted to offer one last tribute to the prince and princess who had touched their lives so deeply. Alexander and Charlotte stood together as the anthem played, their hands clasped tightly, tears streaming down both their faces as they listened to their people's final gift. The song that had marked so many formal occasions during their royal life was now being offered freely from the heart by citizens who wanted to show their love and support for the difficult choice they had made. As the last notes faded into the evening air, Charlotte raised the small pine, sapling above her head in a gesture of promise and hope. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, understanding the symbol she was offering, that what they had planted in Valdoria would continue to grow, no matter how far away they traveled. The car door closed softly behind them, but the driver waited several long minutes before beginning to move, allowing Alexander and Charlotte to wave from the windows as their vehicle slowly made its way through the crowd and toward the palace gates. People pressed close to the car, holding up signs and flowers, calling out words of encouragement and love that would follow the couple far beyond Valdoria's borders. As the palace finally disappeared from view behind them, Alexander and Charlotte settled back into their seats for the journey to the airport. The small pine sapling rested carefully secure between them, its presence a tangible reminder of everything they were carrying forward from this chapter of their lives into whatever would come next. The private jet that would carry Alexander and Charlotte to their new life sat waiting on the tarmac at Valdoria International Airport, its sleek form illuminated by the setting sun. Unlike the royal aircraft they had traveled in during official state visits, this plane belonged to the International Environmental Organization that had agreed to sponsor their foundation's initial operations. The symbolism was not lost on either of them. They were leaving behind the trappings of royal privilege in favor of support from those who shared their mission rather than their bloodline. During the drive to the airport, they had traveled in comfortable silence, each lost in private thoughts about the magnitude of what they had just done. The weight of their decision felt different now that it was irreversible, now that they had seen the faces of everyone they were leaving behind and felt the full emotional impact of severing ties with the only life Alexander had ever known. Charlotte carefully adjusted the small pine sapling on her lap, ensuring it was secure for the upcoming flight. The little tree had become more than just a gift. It was a living symbol of their promise to maintain their connection to Valdoria and to make their sacrifice meaningful through the work they would do in the years ahead. "Do you think we're making the right choice?" Alexander asked quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show, even with Charlotte. She turned to look at him, seeing past the composed exterior to the uncertainty that any reasonable person would feel when abandoning everything familiar for an unknown future. "I think," she said carefully, "that we're making the only choice we could live with. Right or wrong, it's authentically ours." Her words carried deep truth. Throughout their relationship, they had discovered that their love was built not just on attraction or compatibility, but on shared values and a common vision for how they wanted to impact the world. The traditional royal path, with its ceremonial duties and political constraints, had begun to feel like a betrayal of everything that had brought them together in the first place. At the airport, they were met by Dr. Jonathan Mitchell, the director of the Global Environmental Initiative who would be helping them establish their foundation. A tall, energetic man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of intense focus that came from decades of fighting for environmental causes. Dr. Mitchell represented the world they were entering, one where impact mattered more than protocol, where urgency trumped tradition. "Your Royal High," he began, then caught himself with a smile. "Alexander, Charlotte, I can't tell you how honored we are to have you joining our efforts. The international response to your decision has been extraordinary. We've already received preliminary funding commitments from organizations around the world who want to support your foundation's work." The news was encouraging but also daunting. Their choice had resonated far beyond Valdoria's borders, inspiring environmental groups, philanthropists, and ordinary citizens who saw their sacrifice as evidence of the urgent need for climate action. But with that inspiration came pressure to live up to the expectations they had created. As they boarded the aircraft, Charlotte found herself thinking about Emma Fitzgerald, the little girl who had declared her intention to become a scientist. Somewhere in Valdoria, Emma was probably getting ready for bed, her young mind processing the day's events and the lesson about courage and conviction she had witnessed. The thought that their choice might inspire a new generation of environmental advocates provided comfort during this moment of transition. The flight to Geneva, where they would spend their first few weeks planning the foundation structure and initial projects, would take less than 2 hours. But as the plane lifted off from Valdorian soil, both Alexander and Charlotte understood that they were crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. The comfortable certainties of royal life, the clear expectations and defined roles, were falling away beneath them like the landscape visible through the aircraft windows. Dr. Mitchell had brought along a tablet loaded with preliminary research on potential locations for their foundation headquarters. The leading candidates included Costa Rica, with its strong environmental policies and biodiversity, Norway, with its commitment to renewable energy and climate research, and surprisingly, a small city in Vermont that had offered to host them as part of an innovative public-private partnership focused on sustainable development. The Vermont option is particularly interesting, Dr. Mitchell explained as they reviewed the materials. The city of Millbrook has committed to becoming carbon neutral within 5 years, and they want your foundation to serve as the coordinating body for their efforts. You'd be working directly with local government, businesses, and residents to create a model for sustainable community development that could be replicated worldwide. The idea of starting their work on such a practical, community-focused scale appealed to both of them. Rather than beginning with grand international initiatives that might lack personal connection, they could build their foundation's approach around the kind of direct engagement with real people that had made their work in Valdoria so meaningful. Charlotte studied the photographs of Millbrook, a picturesque New England community surrounded by mountains and forests that reminded her of the Valdorian countryside she was leaving behind. The town's commitment to environmental innovation had attracted a diverse population of scientists, artists, and entrepreneurs who were working together to reimagine what sustainable living could look like in a modern world. "What appeals to me most," she said, showing Alexander a photo of Millbrook's main street lined with solar panels and community gardens, "is that we could test our ideas on a manageable scale before trying to implement them globally. If we can help one town achieve carbon neutrality, we'll understand the challenges well enough to help other communities do the same." Alexander nodded, studying the materials with the analytical approach he had learned during his education in economics and policy. And the political climate in Vermont is supportive of environmental innovation without being so ideologically charged that our work would become partisan. We need to be able to work with people across the political spectrum if we're going to make real progress. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Mitchell's phone, which had been buzzing constantly throughout the flight with calls from environmental organizations, media outlets, and potential funders who wanted to connect with the foundation. The global attention their decision had generated was both a tremendous opportunity and a significant responsibility. That was the Secretary General of the United Nations Environment Program, Dr. Mitchell reported after concluding his latest call. They want to discuss having your foundation serve as a special advisor on climate adaptation strategies for small nations. The work you did in Valdoria has gained international recognition, and there are dozens of countries facing similar environmental challenges who want to learn from your approach. The scope of opportunities opening before them was overwhelming, but also energizing. Their decision to leave royal life had positioned them not as refugees from tradition, but as pioneers of a new model for leadership and service. The freedom they had gained by abandoning formal titles was being translated into the kind of influence they had always hoped to achieve. As the plane began its descent toward Geneva, Charlotte found herself thinking about the pine sapling carefully secured in the cabin. When they planted it in whatever location became their permanent home, its roots would grow deep into foreign soil, but the tree itself would carry the genetic memory of Valdoria Mountains. In many ways, their own journey would follow a similar pattern, establishing new roots while maintaining the essential characteristics that had been shaped by their homeland. The landing in Geneva was smooth, but the emotional transition was more turbulent. As they stepped off the plane onto Swiss soil, Alexander experienced a moment of profound disorientation. For the first time in his life, he was in a foreign country not as a representative of Valdoria, not with the protection and protocol of official state visits, but simply as himself. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Charlotte felt a different kind of displacement. Switzerland reminded her of the mountain regions where she had first fallen in love with Alexander. But without the context of royal duties and scheduled appearances, she wasn't quite sure who she was supposed to be. The scientist identity that had been somewhat submerged during her years as a princess was gradually reasserting itself. But the process of rediscovering her authentic self after years of royal role-playing would take time. Their first week in Geneva was spent in meetings with representatives from environmental organizations around the world, each offering different visions for how their foundation could make the greatest impact. The European Union wanted them to focus on climate adaptation strategies for agricultural regions. The Association of Small Island States hoped they would prioritize sea level rise mitigation. Arctic research organizations advocated for increased attention to polar ice preservation. The competing demand for their attention reinforced something they had learned during their royal years. That meaningful impact required careful focus rather than trying to address every worthy cause. By their fourth day in Geneva, they had decided to begin with 3 core initiatives that would allow them to build expertise and credibility before expanding their scope. Their first project would indeed be the partnership with Millbrook, Vermont, creating a replicable model for community-level carbon neutrality. The second would focus on supporting young environmental scientists in developing nations, providing grants and mentorship opportunities for the next generation of climate researchers. The third would develop educational materials and programs to help communities worldwide understand and adapt to climate change impacts. Each initiative reflected lessons learned during their time in Valdoria about the importance of combining high-level policy work with personal engagement and community building. They had seen how environmental protection required not just scientific knowledge and political will, but also the kind of emotional connection that made abstract global challenges feel personally relevant. The decision to accept Millbrook's invitation came during a video conference with the town's mayor, council members, and several residents who would be directly involved in the carbon neutrality initiative. Seeing the faces of people who were excited to work with them, who viewed their foundation not as distant celebrities, but as potential partners and neighbors, reminded them of what they had loved most about their work in Valdoria. "We want you to know," said Margaret Shunn, Millbrook's sustainability coordinator, "that we're not looking for figureheads or publicity. We want genuine collaboration from people who understand that environmental work is ultimately about communities and relationships, not just policies and technologies." Her words perfectly captured what Alexander and Charlotte hoped their foundation could represent: a bridge between the high-level international environmental movement and the local communities where climate change impacts were most directly experienced. They had learned in Valdoria that lasting change required both expert knowledge and grassroots engagement, both global perspective and local commitment. 2 weeks after leaving Valdoria, they found themselves on another airplane, this time heading across the Atlantic toward their new home in Vermont. The small pine sapling sat beside Charlotte's seat, having survived its journey from the Valdorian Mountains to become a permanent resident of New England soil. When they planted it behind the house they would rent in Millbrook, its Swiss pine genetics would encounter American soil and climate, creating something new while maintaining its essential character. The house they had chosen was a modest but comfortable two-story home on the outskirts of Millbrook, surrounded by several acres of land where they could establish demonstration gardens for sustainable living practices. After years of living in palace apartments designed for formal entertaining and official functions, the prospect of a home scale for actual daily life felt like another kind of freedom. Their first morning in Millbrook, they walked together through the town center, introducing themselves to neighbors and local business owners with a naturalness that would have been impossible during royal visits. Without security details and formal protocols, they could have genuine conversations with the people they would be working alongside in the months and years ahead. At the local coffee shop, they met David Rodriguez, a former tech executive who had moved to Millbrook to start an organic farm after becoming disillusioned with corporate life. His story of leaving behind a successful but unfulfilling career to pursue meaningful work resonated deeply with their own experience of abandoning privilege for purpose. The hardest part, David told them over coffee, wasn't giving up the money or the status. It was learning to trust that following your convictions would lead somewhere worthwhile, even when you couldn't see the destination clearly. His words captured something essential about the leap of faith they had taken. Leaving Valdoria had required trusting that their shared values and commitment to environmental work would be enough to build a meaningful life together, even without the certainty and structure that royal roles had provided. As they settled into their new routine in Millbrook, establishing their foundation offices in a converted barn on their property, and beginning the detailed work of developing their first initiatives, both Alexander and Charlotte discovered that their sacrifice had opened space for aspects of themselves that had been constrained by royal expectations. Charlotte found herself returning to the kind of hands-on scientific work she had loved as a graduate student, spending hours in the field collecting samples and data for their carbon neutrality project. Alexander discovered a talent for community organizing and consensus building that had been suppressed by the formal hierarchy of royal duties. Together, they were becoming the people they had always had the potential to be, but had never been free to explore. 6 months after leaving Valdoria, they received a package that brought their journey full circle. Inside was a photograph taken during their farewell ceremony, showing Charlotte kneeling to embrace young Thomas Weber while Alexander stood behind them, his hand on Emma Fitzgerald's shoulder. The image had been sent by Mrs. Ashworth, along with a letter reporting on the continued success of the environmental programs they had established in Valdoria. Thomas has been accepted to the International Youth Climate Summit in Stockholm, she wrote. Emma has started a recycling program at her school that has spread to 3 other districts. The pine forests you help protect are thriving, and Prince James has announced that environmental conservation will be a priority of his eventual reign. The seeds you planted are growing beautifully. Reading the letter together in their Vermont home, with the Swiss pine sapling visible through their kitchen window as it adapted to its new environment, Alexander and Charlotte understood that their decision had created the kind of lasting impact they had always hoped to achieve. The love that had brought them together had become a force for positive change that extended far beyond their personal happiness to touch lives and communities around the world. Their story had touched millions not because it was a fairy tale, but because it was deeply human, a reminder that sometimes the most important thing we can do is have the courage to follow our hearts, even when it means leaving behind everything we thought we wanted in favor of everything we know we need to become.